thought I knew my husband. I thought our life was real. But the moment I opened that folder, everything shattered. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the restaurant's quiet hum. What I saw inside wasn't just shocking, it was soul-crushing. Life with my husband Dorian was far from perfect, but I loved him. We had been married for 6 years, and in that time, I had learned to accept certain things. His long work hours, his occasional distant mood, and the way he always seemed to carry a weight on his shoulders that he never shared with me. Dorian was a hard-working man, an attorney at one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. He had fought his way up from nothing, and his career meant everything to him. I understood that, or at least I thought I did. But then, something happened that shattered the illusion of our perfect life. It started with an unexpected conversation one evening. Dorian came home late, as usual, his tie loosened, his face unreadable. I was used to him being exhausted, but that night, there was something else in his eyes. Something that unsettled me. He sat down at the dining table, rubbing his temples. I placed a plate of food in front of him, but he barely touched it. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep the mood light. Instead of answering, he looked up at me with hesitation. "Mr. Calloway wants to meet you." I blinked. "Your boss?" He nodded. I frowned. "Why?" Dorian exhaled, his jaw tightening. "He insists. He said it's important." A chill ran down my spine. Why would Mr. Calloway, a man I had never met, a man who had no reason to care about me, want to speak to me personally? And why did Dorian look so uneasy about it? "Did he say what it's about?" I pressed. Dorian shook his head. "No, but just be careful what you say, okay?" His words sent a strange shiver through me. Careful? What did he think I was going to say? Still, I agreed to the meeting, even though my gut told me something was off. The next evening, I arrived at the restaurant where I was supposed to meet Mr. Calloway. It was an upscale place, the kind where the air smelled like expensive wine and quiet conversations. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I walked in, feeling strangely out of place. Then, I saw him. Mr. Calloway sat in a private booth, his silver hair neatly combed, his dark eyes piercing. He had an air of quiet authority, the kind of presence that made people sit up straighter. I approached cautiously. "Mr. Calloway?" He stood, extending a hand. "You must be Evelyn." His grip was firm, but his eyes held something I couldn't quite place. Concern. Pity? As I sat down, he leaned forward slightly. "I know this meeting is unexpected, but there's something you need to hear." My pulse quickened. "What is this about?" He exhaled, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. Then, his voice dropped to a whisper. "It's about your husband." My stomach twisted. "What about him?" I asked, forcing a smile. Mr. Calloway hesitated, then leaned in closer. "He's not the man you think he is." The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. My fingers curled around the napkin in my lap as I tried to process his words. Let out a nervous laugh. "I don't understand." His expression remained unreadable. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Dorian has been keeping secrets from you. Big ones." A cold wave of fear washed over me. What kind of secrets? My voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. The kind that could destroy your life. Then, he slid a folder across the table. "Look, inside," he said. With trembling hands, I reached for it. What I saw inside made my entire world collapse. My fingers gripped the folder tightly, my breath uneven. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe it, but the evidence was right in front of me. The first document was a bank statement. Dorian's name was printed at the top, followed by a series of transactions, massive transfers of money, tens of thousands of dollars, deposited and withdrawn from accounts I had never seen before. I swallowed hard and flipped to the next page. My stomach twisted painfully. There were contracts, signatures, and records, proof that my husband was involved in something illegal. But the worst part? There were photos. I saw Dorian standing in a dimly lit parking lot, shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize. Another photo showed him accepting a black briefcase. And the final image, the one that made my entire body turn cold, was a picture of him with a hardened expression, standing over a man who looked terrified. I covered my mouth, feeling like I might be sick. What is this? My voice cracked. Mr. Calloway studied me carefully, his gaze unwavering. Proof, he said. Your husband has been laundering money for dangerous people. I shook my head, my mind refusing to process his words. No, this is some kind of mistake. Dorian wouldn't. He already has. His voice was firm. And it's worse than you think. Tears burned the back of my eyes. Why are you telling me this? Why now? Mr. Calloway sighed, leaning forward. Because you still have a chance to walk away before it's too late. He's in deep, Evelyn. And if you stay with him, you'll go down with him. My hands clenched into fists. I wanted to scream, to argue, to defend the man I loved. But deep down, something in my gut told me this wasn't a lie. Dorian had been acting different. The late nights, the secret phone calls, the moments when he looked at me like he wanted to say something, but didn't. I had ignored all the signs, and now I was paying the price. I swallowed back my emotions. Does he know you're telling me this? Mr. Calloway shook his head. No, but he will find out soon enough. A new wave of fear rolled over me. If Dorian was truly hiding something this big, then what would he do if he found out I knew? I pressed my hands against the table to steady myself. What do I do? My voice was barely a whisper. Mr. Calloway's gaze softened. That's up to you. But if I were you, I'd leave before it's too late. The words sliced through me like a knife. Leave? Walk away from the man I had built my life with? It felt impossible. And yet, I had no choice. That night, I barely made it home in one piece. My mind raced, my thoughts tangled in fear, disbelief, and heartbreak. As I stepped into our house, the familiar scent of Dorian's cologne filled my senses. For a brief second, I wanted to pretend everything was normal, to ignore what I had just seen and let myself believe we were okay. But we weren't. We never were. I walked into the bedroom, my eyes landing on Dorian as he stood by the dresser, loosening his tie. He turned when he saw me, a small smile on his lips. There you are, he said casually. How was dinner? My throat tightened. I forced a weak smile. Fine. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. You sure? I nodded too quickly. Yeah, just tired. He stepped closer, gently tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. You seem off. My heart pounded against my ribs. I had to act normal. I had to pretend I didn't know, for now. Just a headache, I murmured, stepping back. Dorian watched me for a long moment before nodding. Get some rest then. I've got some work to finish up. I forced another smile and turned away, slipping into bed. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, one thought consumed me. I was sleeping next to a man I no longer recognized. And if I wasn't careful, I might not make it out alive. The next morning, I went through the motions, making coffee, smiling when Dorian kissed my cheek, pretending everything was normal. But inside, I was screaming. How long had he been lying to me? How deep was he in? I watched him carefully as he got ready for work. Every small movement felt suspicious now. The way he checked his phone. The way he avoided my gaze for just a second too long. I needed to know the truth. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed him. Dorian left home at 8:30 a.m., like clockwork. I waited 5 minutes before grabbing my coat and slipping into my car. My hands were clammy against the steering wheel as I trailed him through the city. At first, he drove toward his office, just like always. But then, he turned off onto a side street. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Where are you going, Dorian?" He parked outside a nondescript building, one of those old, abandoned warehouses no one ever notices. My pulse quickened as I watched him get out of the car and walk inside. This wasn't work. This was something else. I parked a block away and made my way toward the building, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to pretend I never saw anything, but I was already in too deep. I reached the side of the building, pressing myself against the cold brick wall. A metal door was slightly ajar, and from inside, I could hear voices. I held my breath and peeked through the gap. Inside, Dorian stood with 2 men I didn't recognize. One of them, bald, muscular, with a scar running down his cheek, spoke first. "We need to move the money today." His voice was rough, impatient. Dorian sighed, rubbing his temple. "I know, things are getting complicated." Complicated? The second man, younger but just as intimidating, scoffed. "You're in, Dorian. There's no complicated. You do the job, or you pay the price." I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. This was real. Dorian wasn't just caught up in something illegal. He was trapped. I took a shaky step back, my mind spinning. I needed to get out of there before... Crack! My foot snapped a twig. Silence. Then, "Who's there?" The bald man's voice was sharp, alert. My blood turned to ice. I turned to run, but before I could move, the door flew open. Dorian's eyes landed on me, his face drained of color. "Evelyn." His voice was barely a whisper, full of shock and something else. Fear. The bald man's gaze flickered between us before realization dawned on him. His expression darkened. "You know her?" Dorian swallowed hard. "She's my wife." The second man let out a slow, dangerous chuckle. "Well, that's inconvenient." My heart stopped. I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. Dorian stepped forward, his face a mix of anger and desperation. "Evelyn, what are you doing here?" I forced myself to stay calm, to act like I wasn't about to collapse from fear. "I could ask you the same thing." The bald man turned to Dorian. "This is a problem." Dorian held up a hand. "I'll handle it." Handle it? What did that mean? His eyes met mine, silently begging me to stay quiet, to trust him. But how could I trust a man I no longer recognized? The bald man looked at me, his eyes cold and calculating. "You didn't see anything, did you, sweetheart?" I forced myself to shake my head. "No." "Good." He gave Dorian a pointed look. "Because if she did, well, we both know how that ends." Dorian's jaw tightened. I felt the weight of their threat like a noose around my neck. This wasn't just about Dorian anymore. I was in danger too. I took a step back. I should go. Dorian moved toward me. "Evelyn?" I shook my head, forcing myself to sound calm. "We'll talk at home." His eyes burned into mine, filled with something I couldn't decipher. Regret? Desperation? The second I turned away, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. My entire body felt numb, my mind spinning with what I had just witnessed. My husband was in deep trouble. And now? So was I. I barely remember driving home. My hands were cold, my mind racing. Every red light felt like a countdown to something I wasn't ready for. When I finally pulled into our driveway, my stomach twisted. Dorian's car was already there. He had beaten me home. I sat in my car for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. What was I supposed to say? How do you ask your husband if he's a criminal? If he's capable of hurting you? I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady as I walked toward the front door. My fingers trembled as I turned the handle. The second I stepped inside, I felt it. The weight of his presence. Dorian was waiting in the living room, standing in the dim glow of the lamp. His suit jacket was off, his sleeves rolled up. He looked tense, his hands clenched into fists. The air between us was thick, suffocating. "You followed me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. I swallowed hard. "I had to." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have." I took a shaky step forward. "Dorian, just tell me the truth, please." His eyes darkened. "The truth? You think you're ready for that?" I clenched my fists. "I deserve to know who I'm married to." He let out a humorless laugh, running a hand through his hair. "You really want to know?" He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Fine. I've done things I can't undo. I've made choices I can't take back. And yes, Evelyn, I've lied to you." My breath caught in my throat. Hearing him admit it out loud made it real. Too real. I forced myself to hold his gaze. "How bad is it?" Dorian exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Bad enough that you should have walked away a long time ago." Anger burned through my fear. "Maybe I would have, if you had given me a choice." He flinched at my words, his expression torn between frustration and something else. Something that almost looked like pain. "I was trying to protect you," he muttered. "Protect me?" I let out a hollow laugh. "Dorian, those men, they threatened me, and you just stood there." His face darkened. "Because if I reacted the way I wanted to, you wouldn't be standing here right now." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy storm. I shook my head, wrapping my arms around myself. "So, what now? Am I just supposed to pretend I don't know anything?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "No, you need to leave." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" "You need to disappear, Evelyn. Tonight." I blinked, my pulse racing. "You want me to run?" Dorian's expression was unreadable. "It's the only way to keep you safe." I let out a shaky breath. This was really happening. I looked around the home we built together, the life I thought was ours. And now I was supposed to walk away from all of it? Tears burned my eyes. "Why, Dorian? Why did you do this?" For the first time, I saw something break in him. His shoulders tensed, his mask slipping. "Because I didn't have a choice." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, pressing it into my hands. "There's cash inside, enough to get you far away from here." I stared at the envelope, my hands trembling. Then I looked up at him, my voice barely a whisper. "And what about you?" He held my gaze, a sadness settling in his eyes. "I don't get to run." A lump formed in my throat. "Dorian, go, Evelyn." His voice was firm now, unwavering. "Before it's too late." Tears spilled down my cheeks. I wanted to fight, to argue, to hold on to the man I once knew. But deep down, I understood. This was bigger than us. With a final aching look, I turned toward the door, but just as I reached for the handle, a loud knock echoed through the house. I froze. Dorian's face went pale. His body went rigid. The knocking came again, harder this time, more demanding, and then a voice. "Open up, Dorian. We need to talk." The blood in my veins turned ice cold. I turned to Dorian. "Who is that?" His expression darkened. "The last person you ever want to meet." My breath caught in my throat. I had waited too long, and now there was nowhere left to run. The knocking grew louder, more urgent. Bang, bang, bang. "Dorian!" The voice outside was sharp, edged with impatience. "We know you're in there." Dorian's entire body tensed. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might break. I turned to him, my voice a breathless whisper. "Who are they?" His eyes flickered to mine, filled with something between fear and resignation. People who don't ask twice. Bang, bang, bang. "Open the door, or we break it down." I jumped at the sheer force of the words. My entire body was trembling now. Dorian grabbed my wrist, pulling me close. "Listen to me. No matter what happens, you say nothing. You hear me? Nothing." I swallowed hard, my pulse wild. "Dorian, promise me, Evelyn." His grip tightened. "Do you trust me?" My heart ached at the question. After everything I had seen, every lie he had told, did I still trust him? I searched his face, looking past the secrets, past the fear, past the man I no longer recognized, and found the one I once loved. And that was enough. I nodded. "I trust you." His fingers brushed my cheek for the briefest moment. A silent apology, a silent goodbye. Then, before I could say another word, he turned and strode toward the door. Click. The lock turned. The door swung open. 3 men stood on the porch. The one in front, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing, cold eyes, stepped forward. He wasn't like the others. There was something about him that sent a chill through my spine. Dorian kept his face unreadable. "What do you want?" The man smirked. "Come on, you know how this works." He took a slow step inside, his presence suffocating. "You made promises, Dorian. Promises you didn't keep." My stomach twisted. Dorian's voice was tight. "I just need more time." The man chuckled. "Time?" He glanced at me, his smirk deepening. "You've had plenty of that, and now?" His eyes darkened. "Now we take something from you." My breath hitched. Dorian instantly stepped between us. "You touch her, and I swear..." "Relax." The man raised a hand, feigning innocence. "We're just here to make sure you understand the consequences of disappointing us." Dorian's entire body was shaking now, but not with fear, with rage. "I'll fix it. Just leave her out of this." The man stared at him for a long moment. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "See, that's the problem, Dorian." He turned toward me. "She's already in this." "No." I stepped back, my breath coming in short gasps. This was it. This was how it ended. But then, Dorian moved. Fast. In one swift motion, he grabbed the lamp from the table and smashed it into the man's head. Chaos exploded. The other 2 men lunged forward, but Dorian was already moving. He shoved one back, sending him crashing into the wall. The other reached for a gun, but I reacted before I could think, grabbing the nearest object and throwing it straight at his head. A loud crack echoed through the room as the man stumbled, dazed. Dorian grabbed my hand. "Run!" I didn't hesitate. We sprinted out the back door, my heart slamming against my ribs. The night air was cold against my skin, but I barely felt it. All I knew was that we had seconds before they recovered. Where are we going? I gasped as we ran down the alley. Dorian's grip tightened. Away. We reached his car, and he threw open the door. I barely had time to buckle in before he hit the gas, tires screeching against the pavement. The city blurred past us in streaks of neon and darkness. My mind was reeling, my body still shaking from the adrenaline. I turned to him. What now? Dorian's eyes stayed locked on the road, his jaw tight. We disappear. I swallowed. For how long? His fingers clenched, around the wheel. For as long as it takes. Silence filled the car. I should have been terrified. I should have been broken. But as I looked at Dorian, at the man who had risked everything to save me, I felt something else. Not fear. Hope. Because maybe, just maybe, we still had a chance. What would you do if the person you loved had a dangerous secret? Watch till the end and tell us in the comments.